A fool learns from his mistakes, the wise learn from history. Psycho-Pass is full of apt quotes for its characters, but I don't think there's any more fitting than that for Ginoza. A man not of specific taste, but of little taste, who lives by the book, an attempt to be more than his origins of abandonment. Belief in society's ruler, but a seeming lack of love for the society it rules over. A harsh exterior that forcibly says, stay away. Is this his character, or is there a veil to lift that doesn't excuse these things, but puts them into perspective, shapes them into one of the most real and well-rounded characters in a series already chock full of them? That's exactly what we'll be exploring today. Now this requires a dose of Masaoka's character as well, so I'd recommend giving this video a watch if you want the precursor to the story for today, but it's not required at all. But with that out of the way, let's get into things in full. Ginoza's story is one inseparable from his own perception of his father. It's not fair to say from his father, because a lot of what he becomes is a direct response to the absence of his father and how he filled this void mentally. The most obvious trait it leaves him with is a hatred of latent criminals and, in conjunction, the enforcers. There's no shortage of this present in his behavior throughout the series, from calling them dogs to immediately believing the worst in their actions. But what does this hatred say about his mindset? He hates that his father became a latent criminal and left him. He doesn't hate that a flawed society took his father away, as Masaoka viewed the situation. He views the act of becoming a latent criminal as a fault, not a situation, and by choosing to believe it was used to leave him, as a decision to some degree. To him, latent criminals are responsible for their actions and thus face a fitting punishment, whether Sybyl's judgment or his treatment of them. It's harsh, and to this degree he begins the series as quite the apt follower of the Sybil System. And that's another factor inseparable from the way he views latent criminals. Ginoza is 8 when his father is removed from his inspector post and designated as a latent criminal, and he was alive during a period before the crime coefficient technology was implemented. However, Sibyl in its other capacities was enforced in full for the entirety of his life. Ginoza is a child from the first generation to grow up in the modern world that we witness in the anime. A world which bestowed extreme graces upon those deemed worthy, despite its hatred for those not. Like we mentioned in our solo look at Akane, some people in this society legitimately do only see and hear the positives of Sibyl. Ginoza isn't entirely such. His father says this to Akane.
If anyone showed a high crime coefficient, that was enough for their whole family to get treated as if they were all latent criminals.
This means Ginoza, as his father was being taken away, was also treated in some way as a criminal. We don't know for how long or how harshly, but based on his attitude we can assume it's something he never wanted to experience again. We have to reason as well that this strengthened his forced belief in Sibyl. He's seen its worst, but been taught that it's great. On her first case, Akane says,
"Why would somebody choose to let their hue get so cloudy over receiving treatment?"
This is the mentality of those raised under Sibyl, and with that in mind, it's easier to blame a single person, his father, than the lord of modern society. And so he does. His trauma needed a reason, and so he applied the simplest one. Also, despite having his father taken away, he received a high enough aptitude for the Ministry of Welfare, one of the hardest to get, and he's a generally intelligent and collected person. In his later life, he's the kind of person to see the graces of, and thus have a bribed belief in, the Sybil System. So he's able to hate latent criminals as he does. This isn't anywhere near the end of his father's influence, however. In seeing the path of his father as one wrought with mistakes, and his mentality of
fools learn from their experiences, the wise learn from history,
we can see a deeper side to this view. With his bought belief in Sibyl, and knowing firsthand how people can fall to it, this rage against latent criminals is a defense mechanism. One to defend himself from the Oracle. Calling the enforcers dogs, belittling them at every chance, and keeping them down crafts a clear distinction between inspector and enforcer, even more so than what exists in code. This is something he stressed to Akane at every chance, saying,
fulfilling your duties as an inspector is the only thing you should think about.
With a clear distinction, something old-school detectives like his father never had, he's able to craft an order in his life which keeps him as far as possible from the life of a latent criminal, despite working directly with them. He wouldn't allow himself to become something he hates like that. Knowing how despicable and awful they are, it could never be something he would be. Plus, what would showing them sympathy get him? A closer relation to latent criminals, where he can begin to understand the mindset of a criminal. We know that in the psychopath's world, being a criminal is simply thinking like one. Understanding them, having sympathy for them, would facilitate this, so he crafts them as something he can't sympathize with and can't understand. A hard line through and through. One not just between him and the enforcers, but one that comes to influence his entire character. He draws a hard line between himself and, well, almost everything. His joys in life are all things everyone would consider safe and most would say are bland or boring. He collects coins and decorative plants. His ideal fashion style is simple. His car is utilitarian and plain, something we see as a choice from later seasons of Psycho-Pass. He doesn't have a lover or any real friends. Ginoza is, well, a boring man. He's drawn a line between himself and anything remotely dangerous or interesting because those things lead to nothing good in the society he has learned to think of as righteous and correct. One of the more obvious manifestations of this line mentality is his interactions with others. He sees his father as having left him, but also Kogami. His former equal story is a bit less societal than the old man's, focusing on his own desires, individualism, and, with respect to Ginoza's mentality, one which raises questions about choice. Was it Kogami's active decision to become a latent criminal, knowing the path he was on could only lead to that conclusion? Or would he have ended up there anyway, tortured forever by the thoughts, and never finding closure? It raises questions as to the legitimacy of choice in this world, and a sort of man-made fate. Forcing yourself to push down thoughts of criminality may only just create worse thoughts. But while we can't answer those questions, we can say that Ginoza doesn't consider such things. His interests and smarts are concrete, and he puts this decision in the category of choice. Whether his father or his best friend, in his defense of the society he was raised in, he classifies their actions as personal desertion. When he's harsh not just to them but to others, we can see it as an extension of his defense mechanism in a different way. If he's a rude asshole to everyone, then no one will be close to him. If he never finds love, then love can never leave him. And in total, no one close to him could ever leave again, like the way he feels they always do.
Everyone leaves me for the other side of the law.
In his line of work, we can't say these fears are unjustified, whatever his methods become. Inspectors tend to follow one path to the thing he hates. So when a fresh-faced inspector comes on the scene, he's an ass. He gives her no training, little respect, and hardly a hint of kindness. Down to simple things like throwing her jacket at her for no reason. He's so abrupt with Akane because his default state is, "You will hurt me." So he begins to act like everyone already has. But as with everything in Psycho-Pass, it's not so simple. There's more layers to this harsh nature, one of them being, conversely, a genuine care. He takes the actions of others extremely personally. For a cold man, he's actually quite sensitive. To be hurt as he does, he must take every action to heart, and in this sensitivity is a kindness that wasn't quite stamped out with the rest of the niceties. He's able to speak calmly with people who left him, doing so with both Kogami and Masaoka when they speak on their most sensitive issues, the ones that influenced these fates he hates. He gives his all to protect them both in the endgame as well, to his own ultimate detriment. Part of his annoyance with them and others is that they don't accept his help. Now that's a confusing statement because he never offers help, but it is intended in all of his actions. The things he condemns, forbids, and hates are all stepping stones of the path to latent criminality. He reprimands Kogami and Akane on returning from Joji Saiga's lesson because he worsens people's hues. He tries to force Akane to hate the inspectors, knowing what sympathy for criminals can do. He harps on about the obsession they feel and how stupid it is because he knows where it leads. He can detach from these things, and he tries to make them do so as well by demonizing those acts and more. He does these things from a place of concern, just with the worst possible expression. Ginoza has no idea how to express something he's feeling like that. Not only is compassion a weakness, one which confronts his cold exterior, but he also never learned how to express himself. Sybil doesn't encourage that kind of feeling, and we know his father was terrible at it as well. Emotionally, he's a lot less mature than he is logically or mentally. He just knows which words mean what things, and he blurts them out in angry ways. Most obviously with his father in their final moments. He never says, "I love you," just...
Why would you? It's too late now!
We can see some proof of this care in how he treats Akane behind her back. Normally a phrase used before something foul, in our case it's the opposite. When the chief asks about her performance, he has mostly positive things to say.
Due to her inexperience, she acts unprofessionally a little too often. But she's still an excellent employee. I think she has a bright future.
He hates how she acts on her first case, but also doesn't dispute her report. And even some of the more disrespectful things he does, like giving her menial tasks at the drone facility, can be seen as a protection. He's keeping her away from the dangerous tasks, knowing she won't sit back from them on her own. He tries numerous times to get Kogami off his Makishima theory and takes him off the case when things start to seem confirmed. Not just because he's an ass, but because he knows what this case did to his friend before. He doesn't want to watch it happen again. It's roundabout, but he does genuinely care. And another genuine feeling of his that may not present right away is a strong sense of justice. It's distorted through Sybyl's forced lens, but let's look at how he reacts to a few occurrences. When Kogami questions his methods to find Masatake, he responds with,
"So we should just sit around and do nothing."
After a lack of progress finding Rikika Oreo, he says,
"Will one of you please explain to me how we can't find a teenage girl?"
When Sybil tells him they're restricting access to Makishima, and when he mentions the cases he was involved in, this is the exchange that occurs.
Are any of those cases you mention still classified as unsolved?
Not officially, but the truth.
Not to mention, despite hating the methods of Kogami, his father, and Akane, when they produce results on a case, he lets them go, when it doesn't conflict with his desire for their safety or the wishes of Sybil as it does with Kogami. For however much Ginoza is about protecting his own skin, living his life in a way that provides the most benefit and the least danger, he can't be separated from working towards justice. You could say his continued work with the MWPSB, and later the Ministry of Foreign Affairs after falling from grace, shows this as well. He's still working towards something in life, and that something is justice. We don't have to just move forward to see this, we can also look back in time. Like we said earlier, the MWPSB requires high aptitude scores. Ginoza, like Akane, likely had multiple options at his disposal, yet this is the one he chose. The most similar path available to his father's. Isn't it odd that a man who seems to hate his father followed in his footsteps in some ways? This isn't just an offshoot of his hidden love and care that we already discussed, or even simply justice, but also something more. Remember that Ginoza is emotionally less mature than in other areas. I think becoming an inspector is also a way of showing his father up in a sense. A method of saying, I'll do what you couldn't do. I'll be the modern detective that you failed to be. If he sees his father as having left, then naturally there'd be some desire to know if he had to know if his leaving was justified, or if his father was just unable to be the man his family needed. He'll love the system that his father couldn't and show him that it's possible, to confirm the reason he put to his trauma. When he dives full into his support of Sybil, this is also a factor. It's another section of proof that he can be better than his origins. He takes this as a serious part of it.
You began doubting the Sybil System, and then it began doubting you. Whether you liked it or not, a new order was born, and the world and I moved on without you.
Of course, he wouldn't do this without some thought that his father cared, though. If Ginoza despised the man to his core, as he may try to present it at times, then he would have left him behind like the world and never looked back. But he looked back for so long, he became his father in many ways. And we see how he really cares for justice, like his father, and just for his father. In their heart-to-heart, Ginoza offers us a rare smile in response to this.
When I was her age, I had the same belief in justice and society's need for a good detective.
It's an odd warmth for him, and one we can't ignore. He loves his father and loves what he stood for. If Masaoka was a good detective, we can imagine how that would have influenced a young child at home. And from what we said last video, I don't think there's much question there. With a formerly dedicated detective as a father, one who inspired him to follow the same path, even if it was just to prove he was better, there's also a want of approval in that. In one of their last conversations, he says,
"You don't expect anything from me. Like catching Makishima. You never thought I had a chance, did you?"
We don't get many lines outside of this one on this specific point, but with Ginoza's habit of keeping everything inside until things go off the rails and how deeply his father is important to his character, we can assume it's always been there as something he could never admit until he sees the end in sight with a rising crime coefficient and all the marks of those who fell from grace before him. And it's hard to explain, but from my experience, I can say this admission is something I feel true to myself. A lot of my life was spent away from my father, about 7 onwards, even though I see him daily now, quite similar to Ginoza. The thought of letting his expectations down, the knowledge that one day he'll be gone, and so many other thoughts like this are terrifying to me. I've wondered why so many times, wondered why I should care about someone who was gone for so long, but I've never found that answer, just affirmation that I do care. There's something about your origins it feels like you could never escape. Some feeling of familiarity and reason for your existence and who you are that you just don't feel anywhere else. And I can never bring myself to ask why, to dive into the story of someone who's so obviously so much of why I am who I am. I'm terrified that one day, because I can't express myself and bring myself to ask, I'll never know, and so much of that question will be left to ashes alone. But then maybe I don't want to know. There's so much about seeing yourself in someone that's less optimistic. When you can recognize the faults they don't and can see the world they never did. Will I really end up like this person? If I ask those questions of why, what am I really asking out of? Purpose or fear? Will I look at the world as leaving me behind too? Will I be that alone? Ginoza's mentality and story is a fucking mess at times, and I can't explain in any meaningful way why or how that's perfect for what it is, but I feel so much of it to my core in a way I wish I never did. It's fitting that we touched on fear there, because there's something Ginoza fears and hates more than anything else: failure. To the same degree that he cares for justice, he also sees the lack of it provided by him as a failure. And to view latent criminality as a personal choice to leave him means viewing himself as someone to be left. They never say they're leaving or even tie why into him. He just sees it as that and takes that to heart, that he's worth leaving, that he's a failure. Like most things, this plays into his entire character. Protecting Akane so she can't make him more of a failure. Holding back on others' methods because of his need to be right, even if his sense of justice wins in the end. Even his belief in Sibyl comes from this feeling somewhat. Doubting it is the fast track to criminality, to failure. So he has to believe in it and hold it up on its pedestal, even when he knows it's wrong.
That's bullshit! Give me one good reason why!
You can't talk to your superior this way.
Don't you think it's strange we're not allowed to question the mass murderer we arrested?
This isn't my decision.
Notice how all he can bring himself to do is deflect or change the subject. This is forced belief. This can explain why he seems to flip-flop so much as the series progresses. In the span of a single episode, he can go from his nicest yet to his nastiest. A meeting with Sibyl can see him starting to discard what he holds dear: justice, because the fear of failure reigns more prominent for him. He doesn't like what's happened here, but there's a future worse than this present depending on how he goes. And the system abuses this fear of failure, praising him right before mentioning a failure or threatening consequences for unforeseen shifts that could cause failure. By the end, it's outright manipulation of his degrading mental state. His world is falling apart, ironically, completely at Sibyl's hand. He spends years believing in it, going by the book at all times as the perfect, straight-laced individual. His being was dedicated to finding the approval of the entity which discarded his father, as well as his father's approval alike, to being the most perfect individual he could out of this and fear. And he succeeded in playing his role in this society until the seismic event of Makishima shook society to its core and changed the rules. Ginoza played by the book, but the book started changing its own words. Sibyl was no longer a flawless entity dispatching logical justice. It was a weak figure shaping others' actions to fit their selfish goals, most often manipulating the situation through Ginoza. He recognizes this. As we saw, he hated it, but what could he do? Everything about this position had become core to his being. He can't quit now. His life is bland and boring, so he could be perfect at this part of his existence, and now it's actively abusing and going against him, despite his best efforts for so many years.
Sure is ironic. The way I've conducted myself ever since, it was all to avoid his fate, yet here I am.
In the final episodes, he's erratic. He shifts from seemingly depressed to outright wrath. He speaks on things he never would before, opening up because the world tore away his shield. Giving into the methods that led those before him into the failure he hates so much, even while still condemning them in the same breath. He's hypocritical and spiteful, but is working to protect his friend, even knowing his methods can't do so. But what else is there to do? The world is falling apart. Sybil is just a house of cards on a base of tissue paper resting on stilts. It survives because everything around it props it up and believes in it at all times. A life built around something like that is just as weak. Ginoza is a self-fulfilling prophecy. He made up his mind about the world and the people in it and then decided to look for evidence that supported the mindset he chose. He viewed everyone as leaving him and then decided to push everyone away so that everyone would leave him. He takes the actions of others unrelated to him and makes them personal, saying, "Why me?" He hates failure, so he never allows himself to grow or change in any meaningful way. And when someone new with passion and change still present in every fiber of her being comes along, he gets left in the dust, watching as the way he conducts his business pales in comparison to her methods. She fails at times, but in the end succeeds overall. He rarely failed in the moment, but in being so static set himself up to fail in the long run, never adapting to a changing situation around him. Ironic for a man whose being was determined because of someone who failed to adapt to the situation around them. Ginoza is the self-fulfilling prophecy of fear. He had intentions to apply justice to the unjust, to protect the people around him from the pain of a fate he witnessed firsthand, to lead and be the best, a model tenet of society that so many could be proud of. But fear always came first. Fear led to his demise, set from the very moment he built himself around it. There's a lot to be afraid of in this world or in society. When you find yourself, it's easy to wish everything would stay the same so you can just keep being you. But it never works that way. As others find themselves, they also shift and shape society, as we all do, to figure things out. In small ways, we all craft the world around us more in our own image, for better or for worse. Sometimes in a gentle and caring way from behind the scenes. Sometimes outright and passionately decrying the evil we witness. Sometimes well-meaning but harsh in its execution. That's just how it goes. The world would be boring if we never changed society. And it'd be boring if it was only a few of us doing it. As long as you're reasonable and humane, be yourself that passively exerts itself on society. Don't let a system or the past or fear of failure or the future do it for you. Fail. Fail to your heart's content with a full life. Sure, fools may only learn from their own mistakes and the wise may learn from history, but what's history but a collection of long-gone fools? A lengthy ledger of mistakes that eventually became something else through the will of a fool. A bunch of fools who fooled us into thinking they were wise. That's the power of a fool, the one we all have. If we're all fools, then fools becomes nothing more than a meaningless word. So let's make some meaninglessness today. If you liked our discussion today, go ahead and like, share, or let me know what you thought directly below. In the top comment as well, I'll have my links for my Discord, Patreon, and Twitter, so check those out if you have a chance. But anyway, I'll just say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the story today and that I will see you again sometime soon.